Good evening and welcome to Chasing the Facts. I'm Sam Chase, your host, and with us this evening is Chris Lavallee, who is the Vice Chair of the Chelmsford Planning Board. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
I believe this is your second time, or not counting the election season. So
Correct.
It would be the third time.
Yes.
Okay, but who's counting, right? So we're glad to have you, and as you're familiar with the show format, we like to start off with a little bit of an introductory biography. Anything you want to say, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. So we'll turn it back over to you.
Sounds good. So my name is Chris Lavallee. I am the Vice Chair of the Planning Board. I started as the Vice Chair this past year, and in my full term, my first full term as a full Planning Board member. From the election season. I've been on the planning board now for almost 2 years, I think, as the associate member first and then moving up into the regular seats. And it's been a very rewarding time on the planning board. I get to use my project management background, my management background. I'm currently at Harvard Business School as a managing director of research technologies, and I get to use a lot of the management expertise and experience in the planning board as well.
Well, that's a very succinct snapshot of your background and your experience your relevant experience that you bring to the planning board. And I'll just make a wild observation here. I would say, looking at the members that you currently have on the board, I would say that each one does have some unique experience that they bring to the board, and I think the whole thing melds very well together.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good composition of the board at the current time. Various backgrounds, various perspectives. Not everyone's from the same perspective, so it really gives a good, sometimes heated discussion.
Well, it makes the meetings interesting to watch.
It does. But it is a really good mix of perspectives for these projects.
Yes, and I think that certainly that benefits the town. One thing I have noticed, though, watching the planning board meetings probably now for 25 years or so, it appears to me that the perspective has shifted slightly. Say, going back 3 or 4 years ago, we had a board that was more apt to be developer-focused in the way that a developer would bring a project before the board, and the board, it seemed at times that the board was sort of cheering the developer on in the process. And what you've had over the last 2 or 3 years, it seems to me you've had a change in membership of the board, and the board is more representative of the town at large and maybe citizen sentiment. Do you share that opinion or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is a big shift, and I think it's a shift that developers are noticing, townsfolk are noticing, and members of the board and staff are noticing too. I think that it's not so much that we're not developer friendly. I think most of us on the board welcome development, but it's more of a critical eye on what development is going to go where. We want to make sure that the right projects are going into the right locations in town, and that we're able to provide the appropriate support and infrastructure to the projects that are coming in. And I think that in the past, it really has been not a board that doesn't want to challenge developers. But I think this board is willing to be a little bit more critical of the projects coming before us and looking at what the developers are saying and not necessarily taking it at face value, but doing our own research, doing peer reviews where they haven't been done in the past, and really looking at what's best for the town instead of what's best for the developer who's in it really to make money in most cases.
I would say in all cases, or they're in the wrong business.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that assessment, and I think the town has benefited over the last 2 years. And that's not to say, obviously, that the planning board is the final authority on whether a project can be permitted or not. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that. And the reason I would like to have you address that is because I have conversations with residents all the time about planning and development in town, housing and commercial development and so forth. And I find that people are just don't understand the role of the planning board with regard to the extent of the authority that you have to control whether a project is sited. You know, we have to deal with property rights and things like that. And so I'd just like you to address that issue a little bit and explain to folks the extent of your ability to control the siting and permitting of a project.
Sure. There are two roles of the planning board. One is a little bit more proactive and in terms of the planning and making zoning for the town and bringing those changes and updates to town meeting. The other role is, I think, the more visible for the planning board that the public sees the most of, and that's the regulatory aspect. And our role in those hearings is to look at a project before us that's being proposed and apply our current town bylaws and state zoning bylaws to that project to make sure that it is within those bylaws. As long as the project is within those bylaws, whether we like it or not, we have to approve it. Now, there's some
Let me
areas-
interrupt you.
Sure.
Because that is a very important point, which is not all the time understood by
Correct.
the public. And I'm not disrespecting the public. It's just that that's not something that they would generally understand unless they have been involved in these kinds of situations. So please continue.
There are some areas where we do have a little bit more leeway, but in most cases, if the project meets the bylaws for the town and the state, then we have to approve it, even if we don't like it. So we are bound by the bylaws. Now, we can then look at those bylaws and make sure that they're appropriate for the areas that they're zoned for, make sure that they're appropriate for what projects we want to have in town. But that does take time. And part of the current board is trying to get some time on our schedule so that we can take a more proactive look at where those zoning bylaws, the overlays, and some of the criteria that we use can be updated to be a little bit more protective of the town or be a little bit more prescriptive in terms of where some of these projects can go. Perfect example is a recent project that came before us, 150 North Road. It is a daycare that was being proposed on North Road in a very congested area of town. It was proposed under the Dover Amendment, which is essentially a state law that allows an educational institution, religious institution, or daycare to come in and essentially bypass some of the zoning, or most of the zoning. It also restricts the amount of restrictions and changes that we can make to the project itself. So in this case, we, under the Dover Amendment, we're only allowed to look at reasonable regulations on parking, size of the building with respect to the lot itself, and some of the the typical zoning dimensions like setbacks and things like that. If the project meets all those requirements, we're essentially bound by the state law to pass this project. If we were to deny it, it would likely end up in land court and be overturned. Now, as part of this last project, the applicant was willing to work with us on a few concessions. So based on their site, our town bylaw requires 81 parking spaces. They were proposing 50. And again, parking is one that we can provide reasonable regulations on and restrictions, but not unreasonable for their business.
So they were looking for a waiver on that one,
Yeah.
that one requirement.
And they actually came before us with pretty good data from past centers that they've opened with data that shows their operation as sized does not require more than 57 parking spaces. And in this location, they were estimating 50. So,
The operative word being estimating.
yes. So what we did is we really couldn't give any legitimate cause for saying, no, you have to come to the 81 parking spaces that are required for our zoning. But what we could do is say your studies that you provided us and that you showed other towns when you were opening centers in their towns showed 57 parking spaces was the ideal for your operations. So we said, using that data, we're asking you to put in 57 instead of the 50 that you're proposing. Another issue with that location
And they agreed.
and they agreed. Another issue that came up is safety for that area. And they proposed, as part of their application, 2 crossing signals at 2 different locations near their project. They also proposed looking at the traffic signal timing at a traffic light intersection near their project. So they voluntarily proposed those conditions. Had we rejected the project and it had gone to land court, it's entirely likely that they and/or the judge would have approved the project to go forward without those concessions and without those special conditions. So as a board, we had to weigh the likelihood of us getting overturned in a negative determination. Most of us on the board were very vocal that we did not think this was a good location for this project. We liked the project, but not in that location. But if we were to deny it, it's likely that it would have gone to land court, been overturned.
Extremely likely.
Yes.
In my
And
experience, yes.
And we would have lost all of those special conditions in that case. So in that case, our hands were tied because of the state regulations. Even though we didn't like the project in that location, even though we pleaded for the applicant to try and find a different location, primarily because they're converting residential lots into a commercial.
Yes, and that's interesting. That's a very interesting point, because years and years ago, I think the planned use for that particular piece of property or pieces of property to several lots was intended to be residential.
Yep.
And the town had actually made some preparation for that.
Yep.
And probably the announcement of this particular project caught the neighbors off guard, because many of them have been there for 30, 40 years, and they were aware of the prior thought process for the use of that property. So, yeah, and the neighbors were quite vocal. I watched most of your meetings, and I actually know some of the people quite well. And one of the abutters was very concerned, and I spent probably 15 or 20 minutes with her on the phone, and I told her, I said, look, I said, the planning board, I said, this is probably one of those cases where the planning board's hands are really going to be tied, because they're fighting a state override law, I call it, overrides the local zoning. And the comment was, well, they don't have to grant special permits. And I said, well, yeah, they do. I said, because the standard is that they can't be unreasonably withheld. And there's all kinds of case law on that.
Yep.
So I mean, I thought that whole situation was an extremely difficult one for the planning board, but it's also very instructive, and it's a good textbook case for how you try to make lemonade out of lemons, for lack of a better way of characterizing it, because I think if I remember watching the meeting, I think every member of your board said, look, this is just not the right spot for this thing, but we're going to do the best we can with it, and that's what you've done. And hopefully the neighbors understand that. I think they probably do, because
Yeah, I've had a couple calls from neighbors since that hearing, and They thanked us for attempting to work
Yes.
with the applicant, and I went on to explain some of the further legal issues that we were facing. And unfortunately, you're right, our hands were extremely tied on
Pretty
that
much,
one.
yeah. That brings me to another point. Just you touched a little bit on it. The overall zoning template for the town. If you've lived in town for 45, 50, or 60 years, I think you've seen the progression, and you realize, and this is just my opinion, that the zoning really has never been approached from a comprehensive or a holistic starting point. I would argue that most of the zoning regulations that are in town are a result of spot zoning. You know, people deciding, well, this little area should be this little area should be that, without any thought as to how this is going to look for the entire town or how it's going to impact the town in a holistic manner from an economic standpoint. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely, and that's one of the areas that our planning board really wants to start addressing a little bit more.
And how would you do that?
So there are a couple things that we're going to start doing. We've been prioritizing some of the work in our work sessions that we've been having. We're first going to take a look at the overlays to make sure that they're still meeting their purpose, to make sure that they're in the right areas, and to make sure that the performance standards that are in those overlays are up to where we need them to be.
And we have many, don't we?
We do.
Yes.
We do. And that's part of the confusion, is that we have a lot of overlays, and some of them are probably outlived its usefulness. Some of them are probably still used, but we need to make sure that a lot of the changes that have been happening with environmental protection and some of the aquifer protection are starting. We need to make sure that those are built into those overlays as well. Some areas they're not. So we have to take a look at our overlays in general and make sure that those are up to speed. The other area that we're going to take a look at are the zoning conflicts in town. 2 years ago, I think, NEMCOG worked with the town to identify areas of...
Explain what NEMCOG is, just briefly.
Oh gosh, I can never remember the acronym, but it is...
Northern Middlesex Council of Governments.
Thank you.
Okay, so you know what they do, though?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
They're a state organization that works in our region, works with some of the local town governments in our area, town and city governments, to help with consulting, planning. They also help interpret some of the state laws into what are more actionable items for the planning boards. They worked with us on interpreting the MBTA zoning and doing a lot of the background calculations for us so that we didn't have to do that, and gave us the data that we needed to make our decisions. They did the same thing with the zoning conflicts in town. So they looked at the zoning overlays, they looked at the underlying zoning, they looked at different areas of town for the zoning and then the use. And they looked at areas that are either very abrupt changes in zoning and not the gradual zoning that you would want to buffer, or they looked at areas where the zoning did not match the actual use on the ground. And so they identified a number of areas across town, and as a planning board, we recently prioritized them, and we're going to start taking a look at where those zoning conflicts are and what we can do to mitigate them. In some cases, it's changing the zoning from maybe commercial or industrial to residential. In some areas, it's widening the buffer zone between two abrupt zones. And so the NEMCOG group gave recommendations, a number of recommendations and options for each conflict. And so we're going to start looking at those conflicts and seeing if there's some changes that we can make and propose to town meeting in an upcoming town meeting for to alleviate some of these conflicts.
And that is the process. So if you as a board, you work together and you define some of these things, and now it's time to actually get them implemented or try to get them implemented. So the process is you would then, would you have public hearings first?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you would have public hearings, and then you would obviously, as a board, you would vote to recommend, you know, putting the article forward, and then it would go to town meeting, and then what happens after that?
So after town meeting,
Yeah.
it gets reviewed by the Attorney General to make sure it complies with all of the state laws and that there are no conflicts with the state zoning regulations. And then after they put their stamp of approval on it, it gets recorded and becomes a new zoning law.
Well, that's looking at the zoning maps in Chelmsford, I say that's a lot of work, but I also think, it's long overdue.
I think so too.
And I think if we had some zoning realignment in the town, it would resolve a lot of the day-to-day issues that you're dealing with on, you know, when these things come up individually and the conflicts arise. And so I commend you. Now, would that work mostly be done in work sessions, or would you do it in your public meetings, or a combination maybe?
I think a combination. There's also a situation where we may want to look at a larger body of work and put together a working group with a couple other groups in town that might also have a stake in those changes. We've been working closely with Conservation Commission on a number of projects, so depending on the zone that we're looking at, or depending on the bylaw changes that we want to make, we may form a small subcommittee with them. We may have residential representation. So depending on what the changes are, we may do a small working session with the planning board and then follow the process of bringing it to all of the other stakeholders and revising as we go. Or we may, depending on the approach, we may look at possibly doing a subcommittee and then bringing that recommendation to the full board.
So we have 7 members that are elected as full members, and then we have an alternate member. So explain a little bit how that works. I think that's a great situation, but why don't you explain that to the viewers?
Sure. So for some voting for special permits, we need a supermajority. So we essentially need 5 people to be in the affirmative in order to pass some of these special permits and hearings. And because some of them can go on for, we've had some of these go on
Forever.
for over a year, it is very challenging to keep updated and keep active. And you can only miss one meeting or one of the sessions before you're not allowed to vote on the project. And even if you miss that one, you have to get what's called mullined in, and you have to watch the video, read the transcripts and the minutes, and get caught up on that meeting, and then you attest that you've been caught up and you can now vote again. If you miss a second meeting, you're not allowed to vote.
That's it, you're done.
You're done. So because of the need for 5 people, the chances of us having enough people to make a vote goes down as the project goes on. So for a lot of these big ones, we need what I call a bench, and to have that associate member be available to hear all of these sessions and to be available to be a voting member if we don't have enough full members.
Or I would guess if somebody would have to recuse themselves and just not
Yeah.
be a part of that discussion at all.
Yeah,
then
that's the other case
The
where-
alternate would step in
Yeah.
at that point.
Yep.
So the alternate better not get sick, is
Yes.
what we're saying. So now, I'm going to ask you, and I hope you know because I don't, you have 7 members and an alternate. Now, is that something that's fixed by state law, or can you have, I can't imagine having less members on the planning board, but can you have more? Do you know?
I do not know if you're able to have more. I don't know if that's fixed at the state level, but I do think our town charter
Fixes it?
fixes it.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the town were wanting to increase it, if we'd be able to. I'm not sure.
I think 7 is a good number, and I can, and I'm actually now I'm going to look and see and get the answer to that. Some of your committees, there's wide variation. For example, Finance Committee in town, we're fixed at 7 members. Some towns have 9. Town of Concord has 15. Can you imagine? I mean, that's like a mini town meeting. I don't think I'd want to be a member of the FinCom in Concord. That must be a very interesting experience. And then we have the dynamic of elected versus appointed. In some towns, the planning board is appointed. In Chelmsford is elected. Give us your feeling on that. How do you feel about the
I think
situation
for the
of
work
elected?
that we're doing, I like the ability to elect the planning board. I think it gives us the freedom to really look at a case and not necessarily be beholden to the town. We're beholden to the people in the town, and that's who we're really protecting and keeping an eye out for. So I think that the work we do is, I think it's appropriate to be in an elected position.
That's a very good point, because I don't think we have it in this town, but there could be a situation where you have a town manager who is just exceptionally pro-development, and it's, I don't care what it is, build it, I want the tax revenue. If he's the appointing authority,
Yep.
I get it. I think the elected model has served the town very, very well.
I think it has.
Yeah, that's good. So we have a couple minutes left, Chris. Now, is there anything you want to tell us? You've just disposed of 2 very intricate projects, I would say. Is there anything looming on the horizon that you think may be consequential and you're going to have to deal with?
Nothing coming up that I can see. We just finished another big project on 10 Hildreth Street. It was a subdivision proposal. That went on for a long time.
That went through a few iterations.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was a quite complex project proposed on Hildreth Street, and that required a lot of back and forth with Planning Board and Conservation Commission, because it was part in their jurisdiction as well. So it required a little bit of coordination with them. But I think one of the things I want to stress is that as much as we talk about zoning on the Planning Board, it's only one piece of the puzzle. I think that if we want to be a successful community, and I saw an article in 2018 in the New Hampshire Municipal Association newsletter that said, successful communities use education, incentives, partnerships, and voluntary initiatives, not just regulation. You can set the minimum with zoning, but rarely bring out the best. And I really like that quote, because that's really what zoning does. We can approve projects, we can try and make zoning that won't be a barrier to certain projects, but unless we get the projects before us, or unless we get applicants proposing projects in the right locations, there's not much the planning board can do. So it really requires more proactive outreach from the town and from residents and landowners to really get projects before us that are beneficial for the town.
I think that's a very good quote, and I think it's a good guiding objective for you guys to work to. I've always thought that zoning, if it's done correctly, and if it's done cooperatively and transparently, zoning really should be an expression of how the community at large wants to look.
Yep.
And that's why I've always been very concerned about what I think is our spot zoning situation, which has caused a lot of problems. But you guys, I think, are on the right track. You're addressing it. So we've got about a minute left, Chris. Anything else you want to impart to the public before you leave? This is your chance. And you're not running for office right now. So.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. Well, I have some ways to go before that comes up again. No, I just think that we really do appreciate the public's input in these public sessions. We know they can be long, they can be really boring at times, but we really do enjoy and welcome the public participation in these public hearings because they often see things that we don't see. And they're able to give us information in the neighborhood that we don't necessarily know. And
Yep,
so we
and
really welcome that participation.
That's a very important point, and we're out of time, and it goes quickly, doesn't it?
It does.
We will have you back, and we will, because there's other things that we would like to talk about that we didn't hit upon. So Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All righty.